In 2026, multiple U.S. states have scheduled executions for inmates who have spent decades on death row. These individuals were convicted of capital crimes, most commonly aggravated murder, and sentenced to death following jury trials and lengthy appeals. Tonight, we examine who is scheduled for execution in 2026, the penalties imposed, and what these cases reveal about capital punishment in America. February 24, 2026, Florida. Melvin Lee Trotter. Melvin Lee Trotter is scheduled for execution by lethal injection. He was convicted of capital murder. Melvin Trotter was convicted of the murder of 70-year-old Virgie Langford, stabbing her repeatedly during a robbery at her grocery store in 1986. Florida law permits the death penalty in cases involving particularly aggravated circumstances, such as multiple victims or felony murder. March 3, 2026, Florida. Billy Leon Kearse was. Billy Leon Kearse was convicted of fatally shooting Fort Pierce police officer Danny Parrish during a traffic stop in 1991. Parrish was shot multiple times with his own service weapon after a struggle. In a capital murder case connected to the killing of a law enforcement officer, the penalty imposed was death. March 11, 2026, Texas. Cedric Allen Ricks. Cedric Allen Ricks is scheduled for execution in Texas on March 11, 2026, for the capital murders of Roxanne Diana Sanchez, Ricks's girlfriend, killed in Bedford, Texas on May 1, 2013. Anthony Reyes Figueroa, Roxanne's younger son, also killed in the same incident. Surviving victim, Marcus Figueroa, Roxanne's older son at the time, survived despite being stabbed numerous times and later testified at trial. March 12, 2026, Alabama. Charles Lee Burton Jr. Charles Lee Burton Jr. is scheduled for execution. Burton and 5 others participated in an armed robbery targeting the AutoZone. During the course of this robbery, Doug Battle was shot and killed by another robber, not Burton. The state prosecuted Burton as an accomplice whose participation in the felony made him punishable for the resulting death under Alabama's capital murder statutes. The actual shooter, Derek DeBruce, had his death sentence later reduced to life imprisonment. March 17, 2026, Florida. Michael Lee King. Michael Lee King convicted in a high-profile kidnapping and murder case of Denise Amber Lee. On the afternoon of January 17, 2008, King took Denise from her home and transported her in his vehicle while holding her against her will. She was bound and raped. She made multiple 911 calls pleading for help. Later that evening, King shot and killed her, then buried her in a shallow grave in a wooded area. Police found King later that night and arrested him. King was convicted of kidnapping, sexual battery, and first-degree murder, and in 2009, a jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. April 30, Texas. James Garfield Broadnax. Broadnax was convicted of capital murder for the fatal shootings of 2 men outside a Garland, Texas music studio. Stephen Swan, 26, a Christian music producer. Matthew Butler, 28, the owner of the recording studio where both were killed. On June 19, 2008, Broadnax and an accomplice fatally shot Swan and Butler in the parking lot of Zion Gate Records in Garland during a robbery. They gained only a small amount of cash and stole one of the victim's vehicle before being arrested days later. Broadnax openly admitted to killing both men and was sentenced to death in 2009. May 14th, Texas. Edward Lee Busby Jr. Edward Lee Busby Jr. also received a death sentence for the murder of Laura Lee Crane, age 77, a retired Texas Christian University professor and former director of the Star Point School in Fort Worth, Texas. Edward Lee Busby Jr. was convicted of kidnapping, robbing, and killing her on January 30, 2004. Prosecutors presented evidence that Busby abducted Crane from a grocery store parking lot, forced her into the trunk of her vehicle, wrapped her head with duct tape, and she died of asphyxiation. Her body was found several days later near an Oklahoma highway. May 20th, Arizona Leroy Dean McGill. Leroy Dean McGill is scheduled for execution. Leroy Dean McGill entered an apartment, poured gasoline on Charles Perez and Nova Banta, and ignited the accelerant, resulting in Perez's death from burns, Banta's life-threatening injuries, a fire that endangered others in the residence. A jury convicted McGill of first-degree premeditated murder, arson, endangerment, and attempted murder. The sentence was affirmed on appeal. May 21st, Tennessee, Tony Von Carruthers. Tony Von Carruthers is scheduled for execution. Tony Von Carruthers was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Marcellos Anderson, Delois Anderson, Marcellos's mother, Frederick Tucker. According to court records and reporting, Carruthers and his accomplice kidnapped the 3 victims in Memphis in February 1994. They were shot or otherwise killed. Then their bodies were buried alive in a grave dug at Rose Hill Cemetery. Prosecutors described the murders as especially heinous and cruel, warranting the death penalty. Carruthers was convicted by a Shelby County jury in 1996 and sentenced to death for all 3 murder convictions. August 13th, Tennessee. Anthony Darrell Dugard Hines. Anthony Darrell Dugard Hines was sentenced to death after conviction for capital murder of Catherine Jean Kathy Jenkins. On March 3, 1985, Jenkins was working alone, cleaning rooms and handling motel funds. Hines, who had recently traveled through the area, entered the motel and attacked her. He stabbed her multiple times, robbed her, and took her vehicle and belongings. Evidence at trial included Jenkins's car, wallet, and keys found in Hines's possession shortly after the homicide. Hines's actions were prosecuted as capital murder because the homicide occurred during robbery and sexual assault. August 19th, Ohio, James Derek O'Neill. James Derek O'Neill is scheduled for execution by lethal injection for the murder of Carol Ann O'Neill, James Derek O'Neill's estranged wife. On December 11, 1993, O'Neill broke into his estranged wife's home in Cincinnati, Ohio, and fatally shot her after a domestic dispute. O'Neill later confessed to police and was convicted of aggravated murder for her killing. According to court records, Carol had filed a domestic complaint against O'Neill, and after he was kicked out of the home earlier that week, he returned later and shot her as she tried to hide in their bedroom. September 30th, Tennessee, Krista Gale Pike. Krista Gale Pike is one of the rare female inmates scheduled for execution. Pike murdered Colleen Slemmer, age 19, Pike's classmate at Job Corps in Knoxville, Tennessee. On January 12, 1995, Pike lured Slemmer to a secluded area of the University of Tennessee agricultural campus under the pretense of making peace. There, Pike and an accomplice brutally attacked her. Evidence at trial showed that Slemmer was beaten and stabbed with a box cutter and a miniature meat cleaver. A pentagram was later carved into her chest. Pike admitted to attacking Slemmer and even kept a piece of her skull as a souvenir. Pike was convicted of premeditated first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder in 1996. Pike's former boyfriend and another accomplice were also involved. One received a life sentence, while the other cooperated with authorities. Pike was sentenced to death for the murder of Slemmer, a conviction upheld on appeal by the Tennessee Supreme Court. October 21st, Ohio, Jerome Henderson. Jerome Henderson is scheduled for execution for the murder of Mary Akoff, Henderson's neighbor in Cincinnati, Ohio. On March 3, 1985, Henderson broke into Akoff's apartment, attempted to rape her, and stabbed and beat her to death. Her body was later found by her young daughter inside the apartment. Evidence at trial included Akoff's blood and other physical evidence linking Henderson to the scene. He was convicted of aggravated murder and related counts. November 18th, Ohio, Melvin D. Bonnell, Jr. Melvin D. Bonnell, Jr. remains on the 2026 schedule of death penalty for the murder of Robert Eugene Robert E. Bunner. Melvin Bonnell, Jr. was convicted of fatally shooting Bunner inside his apartment in Cleveland, Ohio on November 28, 1986. According to official court summaries, Bonnell entered the apartment without permission in the early morning hours. He shot Bunner multiple times at close range, then struck him in the face after he fell to the floor. Bunner's two roommates witnessed parts of the attack. Bonnell was convicted of aggravated murder and related felony charges during a trial in 1988 and was sentenced to death. December 3rd, Tennessee. Gary Wayne Sutton. Gary Wayne Sutton was convicted of the 1992 murders of two people. Tommy Griffin, Sutton's close friend, shot to death in Blount County, Tennessee. Connie Branham, Griffin's sister, whose body was later found in her burned vehicle in nearby Sevier County. The state charged Sutton and his co-defendant James Dellinger with the killings of both Griffin and Branham. Sutton received a death sentence for Griffin's murder and a separate sentence of life plus additional years for Branham's death. Dellinger died on death row in 2023 before his own execution could occur. This is Crime Penalty. Subscribe for more real cases and real sentencing breakdowns.